Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's episode-by-episode review for Lost, Season 1, Part 2. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review every episode of Lost. In this video, I continue my coverage of Season 1 as I cover episodes 9 through 16 of Season 1. This video will contain spoilers up to episode 16 of Season 1, but it will not feature any spoilers beyond that point. So if you haven't seen the whole series, or if you haven't seen beyond episode 16 of Season 1, this video will not spoil anything for you. However, I will have a spoiler section at the end of the video for those who have seen the entire series of Lost, but I will give a proper spoiler warning before getting into it. So as I touched on in part 1, around the episode 9 mark is where I guesstimate the producers actually started building a plan for the show and where it's headed, as they have even said themselves that in the beginning they didn't have a plan because they thought the show would be a failure and be cancelled after a few episodes, but once it was a hit they realized they needed to start thinking more long term. Now, while the first 8 episodes did set up some foundations like the island's ability to heal, the monster, the mysterious French transmission, a polar bear on the tropical island, and the pair of bodies that have settled on the island before, I do believe that they had no forethought to any of these mysteries and just threw them in there because they looked cool. And while it could be argued they continued to just throw things in because they look cool with no forethought of actually explaining it, they did start setting the stage in these next 8 episodes for storylines that would continue throughout the rest of the show, such as introducing the concept of a group of people who lived on the island already and abduct people known as the Others, introducing the concept of the mysterious hatch, and the concept of strange electromagnetism, and they even followed up further explored a few already established mysteries like revealing the character of Danielle Rousseau, who was the source of the French transmission, who in turn introduced the concept of the Others and mentioned several things that would be followed up on, like the Black Rock. They even started to show a clearer picture of where they wanted to take the characters as they started foreshadowing some characters' backstories we had yet to receive, such as foreshadowing that Hurley was unlucky and that Walt was very lucky, and establishing Boone as Locke's new lackey. And they even introduced Ethan in episode 9 briefly in the background to set up for his inclusion in the story. So overall, I would say these set of episodes show a lot more vision, or at least illustrates the writers started thinking more long term. Now, these set of episodes we'll call Midseason for Season 1 are an interesting set of episodes to look at least for me anyway, because this set of episodes features some of what I would consider the best episodes of the entire show, and it also features some of the worst episodes of the entire show. I think in this part of the season, they started thinking more about long-term plots and storylines rather than simply showing a bunch of people surviving a plane crash and learning to live together as the first set of episodes did. And that can be a strength, and it can be a weakness, which is probably why it results in this best and worst split. Because when you focus more on the plot, this results in some of the best episodes of the show. But since they can't focus on the plot all the time, this also results in some pretty boring, useless filler episodes that shows that the stories they came up with weren't enough to fill a 25 episode long season. So anyway, let's go ahead and jump into the episodes, starting with episode 9, Solitaire. So I've heard some opinions that think very highly of this episode, but my honest opinion of it was never that high. Again, this probably has to do with the out-of-order way I watched Season 1, as when I saw this episode, I already had seen the Season 1 finale, so I already was aware of the character of Danielle Rousseau and the fact that her daughter was kidnapped from her when she was a baby. Whereas I can see that watching this episode for the first time, not being aware of this information could seem to be pretty shocking and revealing information, because we heard the French transmission in the pilot, which was a pretty glaring mystery, so it's interesting they solved that mystery pretty soon after. However, as is often the case with Lost, every answer brings with it tons more questions, as her backstory refers to a sickness that took her crew to the point that she felt she had to kill them, including the father of her child, who tried to kill her. And her child was stolen by a mysterious group of natives she refers to as the Others, a name that will actually stick. And she mentions things in places like the Black Rock, and she specifically says there's no such thing as monsters, even though she does seem to be aware of the entity that the survivors refer to as the monster. And to be clear, I like that. I did think this really worked, and it did lay a lot of groundwork for the way the show would go, which is one of the main reasons why I singled this episode out as the first one after the writers gave some thought on where they wanted the show to go. But I suppose the reason why I say I don't think as highly of this episode as some do is mainly I find it boring to watch, particularly on a rewatch, and it's actually an episode I have an urge to skip. It is essential in that it introduces Rousseau, but as a story in itself, I find there isn't much there. As I found the irony of showing Saeed getting tortured, who in the previous episode tortured someone else and ran away because of it, a bit too on the nose and hits you over the head. Ooh, ironic. And while Saeed and Rousseau did have some interesting interactions, I found most of their dialogue a bit unnatural, and some of the character choices felt like it was done for plot convenience. For example, Rousseau's insistent that Saeed can't leave because she doesn't want to be alone, and yet she chooses not to return with him to the rest of the survivors and chooses to be alone, which seems to be a contradiction. And just the way she was able to trust him so quickly after being after being so convinced that he was one of the others, I don't think it was awful. I just didn't think it worked that well for me. Also, I'm kind of lukewarm on Saeed's flashbacks as well. Again, I didn't think they were terrible, and there were aspects of a good story in there, as I did find the scene where Saeed killed his superior and shot himself in order to save Nadia very touching. The problem is, I don't think that moment was as earned as it should have been. And that overall the flashbacks did feel a bit rushed, and I didn't really feel they earned the romance between Saeed and Nadia. It more has a feeling of romance of the week feeling than it did being the backstory of the love of his life, which is what it was intended to be. So when she appears in the future, she kind of just comes off as Saeed's generic love interest and not as interesting a character in her own right. And the episode also features a subplot with Hurley building a golf course, and I actually kind of like this as a subplot because it shows the type of character Hurley is and the dynamic that he brings to the group, and I do think he has a good point about how simply surviving isn't good enough, that people need to be able to have fun and relax, otherwise they'll go crazy. That being said, this side plot wasn't perfect, as the thing with the hypochondriac, who, by the way, never appears again, was so cliche and typical I would go as far to say he was lazy writing, and the ending where Sawyer makes an attempt to join in the group was a bit silly, didn't really buy it, but otherwise I thought it was a fun character building story. So overall, I'd say this episode is okay. It's not terrible, but it's not particularly great either. So next episode is Raised by Another, and this is criminally underrated episode in my opinion, as when I looked up opinion on this episode online, I found it's kind of viewed as kind of just average, which is strange to me because this has always been one of my favorite episodes of the entire show, from the very first time I saw it up to the ending of the series up until now. Now, first of all, I always liked the character of Clare, particularly how she was portrayed in Season 1. In later seasons, she would become a bit too whiny and annoying, but Season 1, I think, did her character right. And I think the fact this character is so underused and not really one of the show's main set pieces like Jack, Locke, Kate, Sawyer, Saeed, or Charlie works to her benefit in episodes centered around her, because it's more like an event in contrast to Charlie, who they overused in the first season and would run out of ideas for. Now, this episode in particular was a very powerful way to explore her backstory, where it tackles the most pressing issues concerning her character, her pregnancy, but I like how it doesn't focus too much on how she got pregnant and why the father isn't still around. It touches on this, which needs to be touched on, but I'm glad that wasn't the entire focus of her backstory. Instead, it brought up notions of the supernatural and destiny the way the show does best. And of course, a possible con job, which is another topic the show handles best. So to me, these Clare flashbacks are kind of like the best of what the show does best, wrapped up in one story, as it explores crucial character backstories in very well paced and interesting ways, and it touches on elements of destiny and the supernatural. The scene where Clare goes to put her baby up for adoption and her pen doesn't work, and it's obvious the implication is that it's destiny stopping her from giving her child up for adoption, was spine tingling. Gives me chills every time. What was even more chilling was the reveal that the psychic telling Clare that she had to be on that one flight and no other, with the implication clearly being that he knew that she'd crashed on the island and in fact wanted her to, because that way she would be forced to raise the child herself. It was absolutely brilliant storytelling moment in my opinion. However, that's just the flashbacks. The island story was absolutely amazing as it builds off of the setup in previous episodes about the concept of another group of people on the island that abducts people. And the way this was slowly introduced by Clare feeling she's being assaulted, but Jack thinking that she was just hallucinating, was so well done and really made this suspenseful. This episode also did a great job at exploring the relationship between Charlie and Clare, which is one of my favorite Lost couples, and this is the first episode that really established them as a couple, even though they did have some interactions before this with the fake peanut butter, for example. But I think this is the first time the chemistry between these characters was really established, such as the whole "we could be friends" scene. That was really touching. And of course, Hurley's side plot of setting up the census was also great. He has a great moment with Sawyer, who tells him that he really knows how to butter her man up. Now, at first I found it a bit unbelievable that Sawyer would just simply give Hurley the manifest so easily after just a few episodes ago he refused, even when he was being tortured, to give up something that he didn't even have. But when I think about it, it makes sense here, because Hurley was showing Sawyer respect as the property owner of the item in question, and rather than demanding it, he tried to appeal to Sawyer by telling him how it would be good for him. So I totally bought it, and I thought it was a great moment. And of course, this all led to what may in fact be the most chilling moment of the entire show, when just after Saeed returns, shouting about how they're not alone, Hurley comes up to Jack and urgently tells him that someone in their group wasn't on the manifest, i.e. wasn't on the plane. And then we cut to Ethan with a very creepy look in his eyes as he confronts Claire and Charlie alone. Absolutely amazing, thrilling moment. However, I have to point out one nitpick about this episode that annoys me every time I watch it, and that is in the flashback of Claire that shows her in Australia when the phone rings. And that's not how phones in Australia ring. That's an American ringtone. Phones ring very differently in Australia. Having been there and having lived in New Zealand for a long time, that throws me off when it rings like an American phone. But that's just a minor nitpick. The post-production team should have looked this up. Still, for me, one of the best episodes of Lost are those that can combine the flashback and island story elements, tell great stories on both fronts, and play these two stories off of each other. And this is an absolutely amazing example of that, in my opinion. So it's still one of my favorite episodes of the entire show. So next we go from one amazing episode straight into another one with All the Best Cowboys Have Daddy Issues. Now, I always liked this episode and had an appreciation for it, but watching it again recently, I liked it even more. And now I'm probably going to think of it as one of the best episodes of the entire show. Rewatching the show in order like this, I noticed for the first time that this is the first episode of the show that was plot heavy. I believe this was the first episode where the plot of the island really kicked in, or at least the plot of the others. Now, as I said, I think the concept of the others was thought up after the writers reevaluated where the show was going, after realizing it was a success and wouldn't just be canceled, which happened in episode 9. So episode 9 first teased the existence of the others, with Russo mentioning them. But before this, they hadn't been teased, mentioned, implied, or anything, making it clear to me the writers didn't invent the concept of the others until episode 9. But I think when they got together to come up with a long-term plan, I think they realized they needed antagonists other than the inner conflicts within the group of survivors, and just having a polar bear or mysterious monster that shook trees wasn't good enough. There needed to be actual people that could serve as antagonists, and hence we get the others, who in episode 9 were introduced as the mysterious people that steal babies. So then in episode 10 we get the amazing, shocking reveal that someone who has been living amongst them the whole time isn't one of them, and they kidnap Clare, who is pregnant. So already they are building patterns. Now this episode is the first real adventure episode where Jack, Locke, Kate, Boone go on a quest to find and rescue Clare and Charlie from the clutches of this evil invader. And even features a full-on fight scene between Jack, our hero, and Ethan, our villain. But the reason I love this episode so much is that it combines this new element of plot-driven adventure with amazing character stories that has been shown to be great so far, and blends these two elements perfectly. Unlike some other episodes I'll get to shortly that has great character stories, but the thread of the week is a throwaway, bland, silly, and uninteresting one, this episode has an amazing, intense story of Jack trying to rescue Charlie and Clare while at the same time telling an amazing character story. And that is Lost at its best. You get great interactions between Jack and Locke as the show really starts to focus on the different styles of their leadership skills, and some great character moments between Kate and Jack, particularly the scene where Jack asks Kate to tell him something real, and she talks about how she used to go hunting with her father. But you also have the intense story, which features one of my favorite moments of the entire show that had me completely in tears, when after being warned by Ethan that if he doesn't stop following him, he'll kill one of them, Jack of course follows him anyway, and true to his word, Ethan leaves Charlie hanging on the tree for dead. And this scene was so intense as they try to cut Charlie from the tree, and then Jack tries to save Charlie's life, but Kate is convinced it's too late and there's nothing Jack can do. But refusing to give up, he pounds on his chest. Now, I watched this episode once with a lifeguard who has been trained in CPR and had said that what Jack was doing in this scene was completely wrong, and he would be more likely to do damage to Charlie's chest and his lungs and his rib cage and cave it in more likely than he would to save his life. But I don't care. I love this scene, and I think it works absolutely amazingly well as a dramatic piece. This also, in my opinion, is the first great use of the life and death theme music, which is one of the most beautiful pieces of score from any piece of fiction, in my opinion. And yes, it was used before in White Rabbit and will be used in a more memorable fashion later in Do No Harm, but I thought this was one of the best early uses of the theme and what really solidified it for me. It's funny when you watch Mission Impossible 3, which was also directed by J.J. Abrams, and many of the Lost writers worked on that film. There's a scene at the end of the film that is an exact replica of the scene here where Ethan tries to save his wife from dying. Even the music is very similar, as they were both scored by Michael Giacchino, but I thought, damn, this is just a lesser version of that scene. Lost already did a lot better. Even though some may say it's a cop-out because Charlie didn't actually die, but I thought that moment where he did inhale a deep breath, proving he was still alive, was an absolutely cathartic moment, and it was a ray of victory in an episode where the bad guys utterly defeated the good guys. We do get this one ray of hope that at least Jack managed to save Charlie's life, and I think that's absolutely important. But the other element to this episode is Jax Flashbacks, and this is the part of the episode I was more impressed with watching it this time around because than I remembered being before. I always had mixed feelings about Jack's backstory with his father, but watching it now, I'm really analyzing it. I see that it really does work, particularly how it couples with the island storyline, where Jack is in a highly agitated state as he feels guilty for Claire's abduction, as he didn't believe her when she said that she was being attacked and thought she was just hallucinating, and they juxtaposing that to his feelings of guilt of wrestling with the tough decision on whether or not to turn his own father in for being drunk during surgery that resulted in the death of a patient. It was a great juxtaposition, as Jack in both stories was in a very similar agitated, guilt-ridden state, and the flashbacks themselves were powerful as it perfectly illustrates the strained relationship he had with his father, and that even though they didn't have the best relationship, you could sense there was a lot of love there, but Jack needed to do the right thing. His need to do the right thing overrid his devotion to his father, and essentially ended up ruining his career, which did in fact lead to his death. So it also gives further insight as to why Jack is so broken up over his father's death. It's not just that his father died, it's that he feels responsible in some way for that death. And again, this ties perfectly into the feelings of regret of having made a mistake that could result in someone's death, which is why Jack is so obsessed with saving Claire and Charlie. So overall, this is an amazingly crafted episode. I will strongly reconsider putting this in my top 10 favorite episodes of the entire show. So after that set of two amazing episodes, back to back, we move straight into a set of really crappy episodes, starting with whatever the case may be. I remember when I first saw this episode after the amazing story of Claire's kidnapping, I was on the edge of my seat. I was waiting to see where they went with it. I was like fumbling with the remote. Oh, hurry up, let's get to the next episode. I want to see the next episode. But instead we got this giant piece of garbage that had absolutely nothing to do with it. I will often use the term filler in my videos, and some people aren't entirely sure of what I mean by filler. And if you're not sure, well, just watch this episode. This episode is the dictionary definition of filler. In fact, a link to this episode should be used on the Wikipedia page about filler, or what a filler episode is. This episode was literally there just to take up space. Sure, it sets up the thing with Kate's toy model plane, but honestly, that whole storyline could have been cut and you wouldn't have lost anything. I know many people who thought that this episode was an that the whole mystery with the toy model plane was a stupid mystery that they didn't care about. It was kind of a cop-out for this episode to introduce this toy plane that obviously has a lot of meaning and significance to Kate, but not explain what that is, and other than some vague reference to belonging to the man that she killed. Many things in this episode simply don't link up to the rest of the show and feel out of place, such as the concept of the suitcase with guns in it. Obviously it wasn't thought up before when they introduced the marshal, and it was just a way to give the characters of the show some guns. And the flashbacks where Kate was robbing a bank is totally and utterly inconsistent with how we'll see her backstory has developed in the future. The whole thing with the bank robbery and how she seduced a guy to get what we now know is just a toy plane is ridiculous, and just a lewd excuse to try to add in excitement. It doesn't fit at all with her character. You could say this further develops her relationship with Sawyer and Jack in this episode, but honestly, that could have been transplanted in other episodes just as well without losing anything. This episode is a complete and total waste of time. I've always considered it, whenever doing any top 10 or top 5 worst list of the worst episodes of the entire show, and my recent rewatch only confirms these feelings and did nothing to change them. If I did grasp at straws for redeemable qualities for this episode, I would guess I'd say when Kate pulls the sleight of hand to try to block Jack from finding the key to the case. That was kind of cool, and as were some of Kate and Jack's interactions in this episode, as it further sets them apart and shows the adversarial side of their relationship and how they feel they can't trust each other. But again, those elements could have easily been transplanted to other episodes and did not at all justify this episode's existence, which shouldn't have existed, as a complete and utterly giant waste of time. So, just as we got 2 amazing episodes in a row, we now get 2 pieces of crap in a row, as the next episode is Hearts and Minds. Watching season 1 again, it's apparent to me a huge downside to the whole season is Shannon and Boone. These characters didn't work at all, and so having an episode that focuses entirely on them is extremely painful to watch. But it's not just that it focuses on the 2 least interesting characters in the entire show. This episode seems to go beyond that and does the worst possible job it could at doing an episode focused on them, as the island story is some of the worst filler BS ever. Again, if I had to look for positives, the one good thing I could say about it is that it established this mysterious hatch that Locke and Boone found a bit more. But again, this could have easily been done in other episodes. But everything else about the episode is a complete waste of time. I mean, we get a dream sequence where Boone and Shannon are chased by the monster that takes up most of the episode, where Shannon dies and dun dun dun, it's revealed that it's all a dream. Yeah, that's a shitty storytelling 101. I just wasted so much time on this nonsense. But more than that, all the characters are acting out of character. It makes no sense for Locke to suddenly attack Boone and give him hallucinogens. He was kind of established as being anti-drug in the Moth. But regardless, the whole thing reeked of plot convenience to me. And even though it was hinted at in the previous episode, this episode delves head deep into the whole Saeed-Shannon romance, which was a huge, gigantic mistake. The actor who played Saeed, I thought it would be cool, as it would shake things up to have the hot white American girl with an Iraqi, but it actually ruins his character a bit and doesn't work at all, and it felt very forced and faked. And the flashbacks are a waste of time, as well as that's done solely for shock value that ruins the characters, as they thought it would be shocking to have Boone and Shannon sleep together because they were portrayed as brother and sister. But as this episode explains in very blatant dialogue that overemphasizes this point, they are not blood related, as Boone's mother married Shannon's father. Game of Thrones would later balk at this attempt at shock value. But regardless, I found their relationship was dumb, and the show obviously thought this would be shocking, but they forgot that nobody cares about Shannon and Boone. Although, again, trying to look for caveats of good, it was interesting setup that Boone's mother screwed Shannon over, which is why she's striking out against him. But still, this episode was just horrible, just another one of the worst episodes in the entire show. So let's get into the next episode, which is Special. Now, this episode wasn't so bad, certainly an improvement on the previous 2, but this is that example I referenced earlier about an episode that has a good character story but uses a nonsense, throwaway, silly, thread of the week type story to try to artificially create tension. And to be fair, this is probably one of the worst examples of that, of a crappy throwaway island story, as it's about a polar bear acting more like a monster than an actual bear, trapping Walt while he runs off, and Walt's trapped in a tree and the bear's going roar, roar. It was just so dumb. It was, again, the very definition of filler. And the rest of the island story is okay, but also not that well done, as I think Michael acts completely out of character, threatening to kill Locke for talking to Walt when it was obvious Walt came to him. And then all of a sudden he takes a complete 180, and likes Locke, like, all too easily. So that part of it wasn't handled very well. But as far as getting Michael and Walt's backstory, all that was handled amazingly well. I thought this was a beautifully touching story that really fleshed out these characters a lot more and helped to explain all their behavior up to this point perfectly. It was in the same vein of Charlie's backstory in The Moth, where it was the perfect summation of these characters, and I love how it jumped in time to tell the perfect story. It perfectly explored the relationship Michael had with Walt's mother, and it was a bit touching how he wanted to stay in contact with his son when she didn't want him to. And I love the contrast of Walt in present day painting Michael as an absentee dad that abandoned him, but in the flashbacks you see how desperately Michael wanted to stay in Walt's life, but was being blocked by Walt's mother. I think this was personified perfectly in a very touching ending sequence where Michael gives Walt the box filled with all the letters that he wrote him throughout the years, where Walt realizes how much he actually did care for him, and he says that it was wrong of his mother to hide this from him. But I love how Michael points out that she didn't throw the letters away, so somewhere deep down she wanted him to have them. It's hard to guess at her motivation, but that was an extremely touching moment that I totally bought. And the episode, of course, also brings up Walt's special powers, which was kind of touched on before, but never really in the forefront as they are here, which added that signature lost supernatural type of creepiness to the episode. It works well for the episode, I say, and adds a nice level of eeriness to it. But yeah, that polar bear stuff is pretty awful. So ultimately, I say this episode is pretty good, but it has some issues, so it's not one of the best. In fact, whenever I think of a typical Season 1 episode, I think of this episode, as this pretty much encapsulates the norm of Season 1. That is an episode with a great, touching character story, but an island story that's just filler and silly. So, next episode, we kind of get the reverse of that. Next episode is The Homecoming, which carries on from the shocking ending of the previous episode where Clare returns, but very convenient for the writers. Very convenient for the writers who don't yet want to explain where she's been. She can't remember anything. And in fact, she doesn't remember anything that happened since the plane crashed, which seemed kind of like a waste of time, as she kind of gets over this pretty quickly, as we see in the next episode. But it adds a extra element of mystery that she doesn't remember her time with Ethan. Now, I used to consider this one of the better episodes of the show as well. In fact, I used to get this and All the Best Cowboys Have Daddy Issues mixed up for a while, and I wasn't sure which one I liked better, as they both deal with the Ethan storyline. But watching it again, I see that All the Best Cowboys is clearly the better episode, and this episode isn't quite as good. That being said, I still like it though, and I think it's a good episode, but it's not nearly as great. I love the island storyline in this episode about Ethan threatening to kill them all unless they return Clare to him. It was very well executed, and like All the Best Cowboys, it's another example of a good plot-heavy episode with some excitement and suspense. However, the flashbacks is where the story falters. Now, to my recollection, my brother, I don't want to speak for him, but as far as I can remember, my brother, Apkin Tomko, hates the flashbacks in this episode with a passion and thinks that they were some of the worst that the show has ever done, at least to my recollection. I don't think quite that negatively of them, but I will admit it's not that good, and it does bring the episode down. I mentioned before when I covered The Moth that they kind of blew the proverbial load with Charlie's backstory in that one episode, leaving little left for other Charlie episodes. That is very evident in this episode where his flashbacks aren't that interesting. I mean, I do like that it shows what he was like when he was an addict, but that's about all it's good for. And what's the deal with everyone in the show being con artists? You have Sawyer, that's obvious, and then Kate conned that dude into robbing the bank, Shannon conned Boone out of his money, and now Charlie is conning women as well. Some people may say, well, that's the show establishing a theme and having recurring themes. I think it's the writers being lazy and relying too much on the same crutch. Maybe that's cynical, but that's just me. And I give the episode an A for effort for trying to tie in the flashbacks to the island story by focusing on Charlie's need to protect women that he loves, but it doesn't really work in my opinion. The flashbacks are a complete waste of time. However, I do really enjoy the island story. The scene where Ethan knocked out Jen with the rock and then pinned Charlie to a tree by his throat and threatened to kill them all one by one was very chilling. Very effective scene. I also love the interactions between Locke and Jack as they try to figure out how to handle this, and it's great seeing them go back and forth, and as they both want to be the leader, but ultimately they do work together for the common good. It was particularly great when Jack reveals the guns, and the fact that Ethan made good on his threat and killed one of them in the most horrific way did really up the stakes. And the final confrontation where Jack got his revenge and beat the crap out of Ethan, who was caught off guard, was also really well done, particularly with the shocking twist of Charlie killing Ethan. That was a nice touch that fit perfectly into Charlie's character. This episode had great character moments as well, such as Charlie trying to reconnect with Clare, who doesn't remember him, who asks if they're friends. That was a really nice scene as well. So ultimately, I do like this episode a lot, but the flashbacks do hold it back from being great. So finally, we come to episode 16, Outlaws. And it's funny, I ended the last episode on a Sawyer episode, and I'm going to end this one on a Sawyer episode as well. Now, I have a strange relationship with this episode, as when I first saw it, I loved it, but after I saw the rest of the series and let this episode sit with me for a while, I hated it. Rewatching it again now, I have mixed feelings about it, as I think some things about it worked and some things didn't. To start with, the opening sequence with a flashback to where Sawyer's father killed his mother and then himself was amazing. It was such a dark and haunting sequence. It was one of the best I've ever seen, and it's certainly groundbreaking for network television. I remember once watching this episode, and someone who had never seen Lost before walked in and watched this one scene and was blown away, and it was like, wow, what movie is this? And I'm like, it's Lost. And he was shocked. It was like, Lost? But it was really good. But the episode kind of goes downhill from there. It's not altogether bad, as the flashbacks were an interesting exploration of how Sawyer has been on a quest to kill the real Sawyer, and that he got manipulated into killing the wrong man kind of reminds me of the movie Memento. But these flashbacks were great and haunting, particularly seeing Sawyer trying to muster up the courage to kill a man, and ironically it was Jack's father, while on a bender, that gave him the courage to do so. I'm not sure if it's the first time we see characters cross paths in flashbacks, but it's one of the most memorable first times, and this is a trait of the show that I love, as it's a 6 degrees of separation feel to it, but ties more into Destiny. Although I will say some of the conversation felt out of place and like contrived writing, as they wanted to get the point across that Jack's dad forgave him for what he did and was in fact proud of him before he died. It felt kind of unnatural the way he told Sawyer this, but hey, they had to get this information out. So I like the flashbacks in this episode. The island story, not so much. Not only was this filler, but it was really silly on top of that, as this episode heavily implied that the boar was the spirit or whatever of the man Sawyer killed haunting him. Now, I heard some other interpretations saying, well, that's not exactly what they're saying. It's like karma or fate or whatever getting back at Sawyer, and specifically the soul of the dead guy isn't necessarily, the boar. But any way you slice it, it's silly. Particularly when they meet up with Locke and he tells the story of his foster sister dying, and this devastated his foster mother until a golden lamb stayed with them and slept in his foster sister's bed, heavily implying that the dog was his foster sister reincarnated or her spirit or whatever. And the fact that this story is told at all was a very clunky way to imply that that's what's going on with the boar. And it was such a contrived scene, because why would Locke even think to tell that story? He doesn't even know Sawyer's past, or that he thinks the man he killed would be haunting him, so it's kind of dumb. And when Sawyer lets the boar live at the end of the episode, this is supposed to be some cathartic moment or something, but it's not. It's dumb. However, all that being said, there are good elements to the island story as well. Chief among them being the I Never scene, where Kate and Sawyer played the drinking game. That starts off all innocent enough, but then turns vicious and ends with them revealing that they both killed a man. Brilliant scene. Absolutely amazing at character building, and the interaction between Kate and Sawyer was golden. Also, I really like the scene where after the boar ravaged Sawyer's tent, Saeed makes fun of Sawyer. I love when Sawyer tells him that the boar ran off with his tarpon. Saeed says, "Oh, maybe he wanted to go camping." It cracks me up every time. So, you see what I mean when I say I have mixed feelings about this episode. I love the flashbacks, but I had some issues with it. I hated the island storyline and thought it was silly, but there were some great character scenes in it that I love. So all in all, this episode is a mixed bag for me, but overall I think of it more positively than I do negatively. So that is it for the spoiler-free section of part 2 of my coverage of season 1 of Lost. If you haven't seen all of Lost, you will want to turn this video off, and be sure to join me in 2 weeks as I cover up to the end of season 1, going all the way to the season finale, Exodus. So be sure to join me for that. Also be sure to check out my channel for many more videos on other shows like Star Trek, Game of Thrones, The Expanse, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching. But if you have seen up to the end of the entire show of Lost, you can follow me to the spoiler section of my video, which begins now. So, as always, I'll do the spoiler section by episode. So starting with Solitaire, which I actually don't think I have anything to say regarding spoilers. It seems like I should talk about Danielle Rousseau, but I'll actually cover her in another episode, so we'll just skip that one. Move on to the next episode, which is Raised by Another, which I do have quite a bit to talk about. First off, let's talk about the psychic Richard Malcolm. In my spoiler-free review, I praised this episode endlessly. However, watching it in retrospect kind of angers me, because it angers me a lack of satisfying resolution or follow-up to the storyline. Now, Richard Malcolm did appear in a Mr. Echo flashback in season 2 that implied that he was just a con artist, that he was a fraud. However, the showrunners on their podcast insisted that he would appear again, and the subject of Clare's prophecy would be touched on again and explored in further detail. In fact, there's a season 3 DVD featurette where in the writer's room they are talking about inserting Richard Malcolm into the episode The Brig and actually having him on the island with Sawyer. However, he never did reappear, and come season 6, when Damon Lindelof was in full asshole mode because everyone was rightfully upset over how disappointing season 6 was, he acted like he never said Malcolm would reappear and that the matter was settled and that he's a fraud and that's it and that's all there is to it. Now, watching Raised by Another with that in mind, that he is just a fraud, first of all, I don't buy it. Clearly, very, very clearly, when they were writing and filming this episode, they didn't think he was a fraud. Secondly, that really makes the whole thing so less interesting. And as it's so more fantastical, exciting, and just plain good storytelling if what he was saying was absolutely true. Plus, it makes more logical sense if he really was a psychic. Now, follow me here. If he's not a psychic and just a fraud, they expect us to believe that a couple in Los Angeles is paying them thousands of dollars so they can fly a young mother all the way from Australia so they can adopt her baby. I'm sorry, but that makes no sense whatsoever, as there are tons of cheaper and much more local ways for a couple in Los Angeles to adopt a child, especially if they're that loaded. They wouldn't have any problems adopting whatsoever. Also, if he was just trying to scam her, he tells her that danger surrounds the baby if anyone else raises him. And then after months of hounding her, she finally comes to him because of a malfunctioning pen that had nothing to do with him, by the way. And he all of a sudden changes his tune to say, give it to a couple in LA instead. I'm sorry, if his real plan was to con her into giving her baby to this couple in LA, that was a really shitty plan, and it's amazing that it worked. However, if his plan was to trick her into raising her baby because he knew that he was sending her on a plane that was destined to crash on a deserted island, well, that's actually a lot more plausible. Storytelling wise, anyway. I mean, you have to suspend disbelief in the whole psychic thing, of course, but come on. This is a show with smoke monsters, polar bears on tropical islands, magic donkey wheels that can move people through time. One psychic is a very small ask compared to that. I honestly think that the supernatural explanation is a much more plausible one in this case, and that was clearly their intention when they wrote this episode. And as he said himself, Lindelof said himself he intended to follow up on it, but too much time had passed and they couldn't come up with an interesting follow-up, and so took the lazy way out and just said, oh, he's a fraud and that's it, that's that, because they don't give a fuck on actually giving satisfying resolutions to lingering mysteries like this, which is very clearly, in this particular case, I would say it's just Lindelof as being a lazy and bad writer, my opinion. Anyway, let's move on to All the Best Cowboys Have Daddy Issues. I actually want to get into Claire's abduction a bit later, but I will say in retrospect, I totally believe it was Ethan's intention to kill Charlie when he hung him from that tree, and Jack just so happened to save him. But other than that, let's just move on to whatever the case may be. Actually, let's not. Instead, let's move on to Hearts and Minds. And I do have something to talk about in this episode, actually. I also brought it up in my I almost brought it up in my spoiler-free section, but then I deemed it was probably too spoilery to someone who hasn't seen the rest of the show yet. And to talk about how this is the first episode that brought up the electromagnetism inherent to the island. And in fact, many may be surprised that it was mentioned all the way back in Season 1, as it seemed more of a Season 2 thing when they got into the hatch and the button and all that. But there was a scene in this episode where Saeed talks about how the compass Locke gave him is broken, but every compass seems to have the same malfunction, and it's not actually pointing north. And Saeed speculates that only a massive amount of electromagnetic energy could throw off compasses off like that. And as we learn in Season 6, the heart of the island is in fact a massive amount of electromagnetic energy. So it's interesting to hear that this was hinted at all the way back in Season 1. In fact, whenever people complained about the revelation of the light in Season 6, saying that it wasn't at all foreshadowed and just came out of nowhere, I shake my head, because the light is established to be the weird electromagnetism, which was foreshadowed all the way back in the middle of Season 1. So it hardly came out of nowhere. But does that mean I think that in this episode they knew exactly what the light is and what they do with it? No. Not at all. But I do think they had a vague plan to make electromagnetism an important element of the island, and so decided to foreshadow it here. And that's brilliant enough for me. Anyway, let's move on to Special. So now I have to talk about how Walt has magical powers thing, and how the show absolutely and utterly failed to touch on this in any meaningful or a significant or interesting way in the future. In fact, during season 6 or after the finale, this was one complaint I would say people had the most. It was the complaint people kept coming back to. What about Walt? What about his powers? What's the deal? Why the fuck wasn't that answered? And they did do this like little DVD extra 10-minute short where Hurley and Ben take Walt back to the island, but that hardly satisfies the storyline. Now, they end up writing Walt off the show shortly after this because the child actor was growing up too fast, and so it could be said that they never got to follow up on this thread because of that. But I've heard several people point out that they knew that this actor would be growing up very fast, and so and that he would soon have to be written off the show. So they shouldn't have brought up this magical powers thing in the first place if they knew they couldn't follow up on it. And I gotta say that I agree with that. And his powers going forward seem very inconsistent and implausible. So I have to say that this is a plot thread that was very poorly handled in the show. So next, let's get to the homecoming. So now I want to talk about Claire's abduction. As we later learn that she was drugged heavily by Ethan and given the same thing that they give to telesection survivors that they took to make them like New Otherton, to basically brainwash them. And this episode is actually really consistent with that, as Claire looks really drugged up in the scene where she first returned. In the following scene, it seems like she's having a massive hangover from all the drugs she was given. So I will give the show credit for this. In fact, the scene in maternity leave that showed how she escaped Ethan could very easily fit into this episode just before her return. However, what I was less impressed with is that in season 3, Ethan is revealed to be just a doctor trying to study why women can't give birth on this island, and whenever they do, they die in childbirth, and try to stop that from happening, and that he was actually trying to save Claire because he was worried the same thing would happen to her. But in this episode, he comes off like a crazed madman, particularly when he goes to Charlie and threatens to kill them all. It seems like he's obsessed with Claire, not that he's trying to save her life. And not to mention, he actually does kill a man by breaking his neck, all of his fingers in his hand, both of his legs. Sounds like a brutal, excruciating death. Doesn't sound like this is a doctor trying to save lives. I'm sorry. Also, I get the impression of maternity leave that what he does in this episode, threatening Charlie, killing Scott, and trying to get Claire back, wasn't sanctioned by Ben and the others, and thus he was acting alone. And yet, Locke says that they killed Scott by coming in from the sea, which is supposed to foreshadow the boat that we see in the season 1 finale. However, if he's going at it alone, how did he get access to this boat? Did he steal it? In which case, is he driving it alone? So, did he dock it somewhere? How did he drive up in a nosy motorboat, dock it somewhere safe, where it wouldn't just float away, come to shore without being seen, kill Scott in a brutal, time-consuming fashion, go back to the nosy boat, drive off without being seen or heard? Sorry, but I don't buy it. So finally, let's get to Outlaws, and the first thing I want to talk about is Hibbs, who's played by Robert Patrick, the T-1000 himself. I do get the impression this episode was setting him up to appear more, and yet he never appears again. A real shame, as he does appear to have a lot of history with Sawyer. Would have been great to explore, and why Sawyer was so ready to kill him when he first saw him. And plus, Robert Patrick is a good actor, so it would have been great to see him again, but oh well. But the other, arguably more important thing to talk about with this episode is the Whispers. As the Whispers appear whenever the boar haunts Sawyer, and sometimes in the Whispers you specifically hear the man he killed saying it will come back around. Once you learn what the Whispers are, this makes sense, as they're the voices of the dead. However, it's not entirely consistent, because they're revealed to be the voices of those who died on the island, and since the man Sawyer killed didn't die on the island, then his voice shouldn't really be included in that. But I do get the impression from this episode that the writers had this vague idea that the Whispers were the voices of the dead that didn't just, they just didn't fine tune the details. If you wanted to, you could come up with some excuses why his voice was there. Maybe it wasn't really there. Maybe the dead were just emulating it, or Sawyer was just hearing things and the dead just wanted to taunt him over what he did, or maybe the spirits could migrate to the island after he did because it followed Sawyer on the plane there. But yeah, that's all fan spawning, really. It's obvious that the writers hadn't thought it completely through, but I do think it shows forethought that the Whispers are the voice of the dead. Anyway, that is all I have to say about spoilers, so I'll see you all in 2 weeks. Thanks a lot for watching.